I'm Jerry Purvis for StarHerald.com, and welcome to another edition of Table Talk. Our guest today is Larry Gibbs, author of a new book, in fact this new book, Nebraska Sweet Beets, A History of Sugar Valley, where he dives deep into one of the area's most important industries. Thanks for joining us this morning, Larry.
You're welcome, Jerry.
Okay. First of all, tell us a little about how this project got started and how did you become interested in the sugar beet industry?
It actually started with a love for trains. When I first came out here in 1968, they were still running the little dinky locomotives at the sugar factories in the fall during the campaign. And I'd grown up on the East Coast and steam locomotives were gone at least 10 years by that time there. So that attracted my interest. So a few years after I was out here, I went around in the fall of '73 to the 4 local sugar factories and I took pictures of those locomotives. And it wasn't more than another year or two after that they retired them. Then it kind of sat dormant for a number of years. Several of those pictures were published in a couple of books and a magazine article or two. And then it sat dormant for a few years till I completed my terms on the city council, which gave me a little more time to work on the research. And basically at that point I just decided, this looks like it could be interesting and investigate it.
As with any writing project, research takes up most of the time in getting the material together to write about. So as you did your research, what did you find that was interesting information or little anecdotes about the industry?
The starts and stops of the construction, particularly the plant in Minutair and also in Torrington for that matter, and the almost construction of a plant in Bridgeport. I was not aware of the problems they had with Minutair. They started building it in 1920 and then they stopped because the market for sugar collapsed after World War I ended, and then it didn't get started again until 1926. And at that point they almost had 3 sugar factories because there was a farmers group was going to build their own. The partially completed one from Great Western was sitting there, and Holly Sugar got an option on some land there and they were going to build one.
Okay, so how did the sugar beet industry get started here in Nebraska, and what was the first plant to be built here in the Panhandle area?
Okay, the first one in the Panhandle was Scotts Bluff. That was 1909 if my memory serves me correctly. There were actually 3 sugar factories in eastern Nebraska before that. The one at Grand Island was the first one, and it was actually pretty successful. It operated until 1964. There was also one at Ames, Nebraska, and at Norfolk. Neither of those operated for very long. The biggest problem they had in eastern Nebraska was humidity. The high humidity constantly was a problem with disease for sugar beets, and they eventually figured out that the western part of the state with a semi-arid climate and irrigation water, which they could control, was better for growing sugar beets.
Right. So after the Scottsbluff factory, where did it expand from there throughout the Panhandle with other towns getting plants?
Well, the next one was Gering, trying to think, then Baird and Mitchell, the Minutair plant finally, and then there was one in, the Holly plant in Torrington was constructed about the same time as the Lyman plant for Great Western, and that was the extent of it.
Right. Okay, so as the factories started to be built, a lot of people came in from other parts of the country to help with construction.
Yep.
So in the meantime, while they're working on it, how did the companies house all the workers?
They built dormitories in a couple of cases. Great Western did, although they weren't necessarily built for the construction phase of it. A lot of it was just around in the area. Lyman in particular, they built a construction camp, a temporary camp with tents and whatever, just west of the existing facility where it was built. As far as housing for employees, they did build dormitories in Scotts Bluff, Baird, Minutair, Mitchell, Lyman, and they actually built a community in Lyman called Sugartown, which is south across the railroad tracks from where the factory was. And a lot of those homes are still being occupied today.
Okay, so how important was it to the growth of the town that when they found out that they were putting a sugar factory in the area?
In the time period between about 1909 and about 1928, a sugar factory was considered the golden goose. If you could get a factory in your town, man, you had it made. And that was the premise they all operated under, trying to recruit factories.
Mm-hmm. So in starting, you mentioned World War I as well. So how did the sugar market fluctuate during those early years?
In World War I, the United States government encouraged the sugar industry to produce all they could possibly produce, because with the war going on in Europe, they couldn't grow and produce sugar there. And again, it was primarily beets in Europe. And when the war ended, the market collapsed. A good example, it was a little bit of a delayed reaction, but for example, the Minutair plant, they started construction in the early part of 1920, and the market had so totally collapsed by the end of the year that they suspended construction and didn't resume construction for 6 years. And so the First World War had a great effect on it, as did the Second World War.
Even though during World War II, sugar was rationed.
Yeah, World War II, the government reacted, I would say, 180 degrees from what they did in World War I. Instead of encouraging expanded production, they kind of sat on it, restricted the distribution of it through rationing, and actually hurt the industry.
Okay, so as the sugar factories were being built, people would come in from other areas of the country or even other countries to help build the factories, and then some of them would stay around and go to work in the factories once
Right.
they're up and running.
Right.
So how did the sugar factory kind of help the ethnic diversity of the area? Did it make us a more diverse culture?
Yeah, it did, because the first ones involved in the sugar industry here were the Germans from Russia, then came Japanese, and then finally Hispanic Americans from Mexico. And that was pretty much the three ethnic groups that were primarily involved in the industry here in the valley.
So when did the sugar industry really reach its high point?
I would say the high point was probably around 1930. After that, it was a series of slow declines. Factories were starting to close, and the Minutair factory, if I remember, I'd only operated for about 10, 12 years. Lyman didn't operate for too much longer than that. Mitchell, Scottsbluff, Gering, and Baird operated for quite a while.
Okay, so what were some of the reasons then that for just the steady decline?
Part of it was increased importation of sugar, cane sugar, and the government got involved and uninvolved several times with controlling the prices of sugar. And instead of letting the free market work things out, the government screwed it all up.
Okay. So what is the state of the valley's sugar industry today, and what do you see for the future?
It's not nearly what it was, partially because of consumer preferences. We just don't use as much sugar as we used to use. You've got so many artificial sweeteners, you've got corn syrup. The only operating mill right now is Scottsbluff. The storage facilities at Baird, Gering, Mitchell, and not in Lyman, no, but and up in Torrington, they're still storing sugar in the silos there. The future, I don't know. If I was Nostradamus, I might have a better answer for that one. I would suspect it probably can continue at least at the level it is now. I know that's not a real optimistic outlook. I know there's a lot of people in the valley here would hope it would start growing again, but unless people's consumer preferences changed, I don't know if that'll happen.
So there's been a shrinkage over the years of corporations that are involved in sugar. You mentioned there was Holly, there was a Growers Association, there was Great Western.
Right. Well, you know, Great Western, or what's left of Great Western now, has the plant in Scottsbluff, and I think Fort Morgan, I think, are the only two factories still operating. And they had about a dozen factories in Colorado at one time also. It's just much less than it used to be. I think the main sugar beet growing areas in the country now are in Minnesota and up in that area.
One part of the book that you also did an article on was in the transportation of the beets and how they got from the fields where originally there were no roads,
Right.
how you got them to the factory. How did you research that?
I was able to obtain, first I got a map from a friend of mine, and it was a map from, I think, 1930 roughly. It was a Scottsbluff County road map. And among the things on it, it showed the beet spurs that were built during the 20s. There were 4 beet spurs on the north side of the river. They were built by an organization called the North Platte Valley Railway, which was a creation of Great Western Sugar and the Burlington Railroad. There was one just to the west of the Mitchell Sugar Factory, which ran up into the southern edge of Sioux County. There was one just to the east of the Scottsbluff Factory, which ran all the way out to the Lake Alice area and then a little west. There was one to the west side of the Baird Sugar Factory, which was the longest one, and that ran all the way northwest to just east of the Scottsbluff Airport. There was a short spur they built, and that was the last one built in 1926, just east of the Baird factory, and that one was only, I think, about 8 or 9 miles long. On the south side of the river, the Union Pacific built spurs, one south from Gering, which ran south a little ways, and then west into the Gering Valley and ended at Ryford. And there was a spur just to the east side, excuse me, just to the east side of the Lyman plant, which went south, split, and there was an eastern part of it that ran to Stiegel and a southern part that ran a little bit further south. I think to Janice was the beet dump at the end of that one. Those provided a method to move the beets before the roads were good. Basically had a similar thing occur with Torrington. The Union Pacific expanded up to the South Torrington area primarily to serve the sugar factory that was being built there. And so that was the way they moved the beets.
Okay. So your book has been out how long now?
Came out August 3rd.
Okay. Reaction so far, what have people say about it?
A lot of them haven't had much chance to read much of it yet. What I've heard so far from people who have given me some responses, they like it. Of course, most of them are friends, so I don't know if they'd tell me if they didn't like it.
Okay, what other projects do you have in the works? Anything after this that you are toying with?
I still want to write the Great American Novel, but I'll probably never get to it. I haven't got anything in the works right at the moment.
Okay. And how do people get a copy of your book?
I have some copies. They have copies at Legacy of the Plains Museum. I think there will be some other places in town that have it, but I'm not aware who yet. I know Walgreens generally stocks publications from this publisher, although I have not seen it there yet. Beyond that, I can't tell you too much here locally.
Okay. And it took you about how long for the whole project?
30 years, but seriously, probably about 2.5 years. Spent a day at Fort Collins at Colorado State University. They have most of the historic files for Great Western Sugar, but their primary emphasis is again on the facilities in Colorado. And there was a real good book out from Candy Hamilton, Footprints in the Sugar, a few years ago. An excellent book. But again, it primarily emphasizes the facilities in Colorado with just a brief mention of the ones up here.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today on Table Talk, Larry.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
I'm Jerry Purvis for StarHerald.com, and thank you for joining us for Table Talk.